And a number of them, especially Orson Bean, would show up on the Match Game panel a lot throughout the 70s, but they also all did the 60s version of Match Game as well. And unfortunately, only somewhere between 13 and 16 episodes of the 60s version of Match Game are known to exist.
And as the voice of A. Ashley Hoff, he's the author of the book Match Game 101, A Backstage History of Match Game. And last time we talked about Betty White and some of the things that she's had as far as history with Match Game and other a storied career of over 70 plus years. And I remember reading about how she tried they had her hosting several pilots back in the 60s, but they didn't want to select her because she was a woman, even though in Great Britain there were a lot of female game show hosts back then. Even in the 70s, I'm writing a book on Jack Barry, and I won't spoil it too much, but Jack wanted Betty to host one of his shows, and he was all for it. He contacted her personally and said, I want you to do this, and he loved the way she hosted the pilot, but it ended up not being. You'll find out in the book which game show that was, by the way. But then about 10 years later is when she got the game show Just Men, which she won a Daytime Emmy Award for.
Yep. Well, and it's funny because there was an episode of Match Game where, and this was just completely spontaneous, I think she said something offhand to Gene, so he said, okay, you think you can do better, so go ahead, host the show. So he gave her the microphone. He sat down in her place. She ended up hosting a round of Match Game. she seemed kind of overwhelmed by it momentarily. I have the feeling she would have been a far better host had it not just been sprung on her like 2 seconds earlier. But it was a very funny moment, you know.
In fact, speaking of Betty hosting a game show, there's a Password 1975 episode. By this time, they had the red, white, and blue set, kind of like the ashes of the Password All-Stars. And Betty hosted that particular episode they got on YouTube while Alan played as a panelist. And she did a really good job. It was like, wow.
Oh, yeah. Well, and, you know, she learned from the best. I mean, she was married to Alan Ludden. They obviously, you know, had a very, very deep, very close relationship. And when you're married to your best friend, I think that speaks volumes about, first of all, your choice, your taste in partners, but also, you know, they were both just brilliant, talented people. I will say this. The game show format has really attracted some of the most interesting and intelligent of performers. You know, when you're dealing with scripts and emotions, that requires one particular type of talent or a couple of types of talent. And but it's a totally different thing. It's very different skills, very different talents. The people who really have worked heavily within the game show format, though, are just brilliant people. They're, generally speaking, very good at improvisation. Obviously, quick-witted. You have to be a bit of a wordsmith to do a lot of these games, particularly the word-oriented ones, like Match Game could be. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I just think it kind of brings out the best in people. It's again, they seem to be happy sets, and they seem to, even if the people are not always happy in all elements of their life, when they're on screen and when they're in the format and when they're playing the games, it's kind of like seeing them at their best. And I think you really see people happiest.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
I remember reading about, Peter Marshall had in his book Backstage with the original Hollywood Square, where he showed, I think it was either the Celebrity Game or People Will Talk. Both of those shows had a similar format. The only difference was Dennis James hosted People Will Talk. And they had about 16 celebrities. They showed the panel one week, and they said everybody on the set had a good time except for Lee Marvin, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yes.
So Peter said
That's why we always had
like 3 standby panelists on Hollywood Squares, which you don't think about. By the way, with Match Game, how many panelists did they usually have on standby just in case somebody was unable to continue?
I think, generally speaking, they just had the 6 booked typically. But I remember Charles talking about how back in the day, he and Peggy Cass were always the immediate backups for all the Goodson Todman productions. Because, like, for instance, whenever anybody was, I don't know, they had a booking and they couldn't make it, or their plane was late, so they couldn't make it into town. So whenever, a show was about to tape, and this was at the time when, everything had to be very strictly regimented, you couldn't, you either tape it or you've got a blank screen, which of course is not an option in television. And so both he and Peggy Cass were the automatic go-tos because both of them were brilliant with game playing. Peggy Cass, who most people remember for playing Agnes Goot in both the stage and film versions of Auntie Mame, did tons of episodes of the original 60s version of Match Game, as well as she appeared a couple of times on the 70s version of Match Game. But she did all the game shows back in the 60s. And she was, again, a brilliant, witty, quick-witted woman. And so Charles also, because, everybody knew him, talked about how, they'd get a call last minute, show up at the studio, and they would be, ready to go. He'd have, an extra suit in the trunk of the car and that sort of thing at the ready, just in case. And I think that proved they were both good sports as well as brilliant game players.
Yeah, and and of course, to tell the truth, was Peggy Cass's big wheelhouse with Kitty Carlisle and Orson Bean and Tom Poston.
Yeah, and a number of them, especially Orson Bean, would show up on the Match Game panel a lot throughout the 70s. But they also all did the 60s version of Match Game as well. And unfortunately, only somewhere between 13 and 16 episodes of the 60s version of Match Game are known to exist. At that time, nobody thought about rerunning game shows because they just thought of it as a very disposable medium. And of course, at that time, there were only 3 or so channels on television, the occasional cable channel maybe, but, nobody thought the game shows were worth keeping. So they would just tape over the tapes and reuse them. And, it is interesting to see the old 60s version of Match Game. I think there are a few episodes that are on YouTube and that they had included when they released the 70s version of Match Game on, or at least select episodes of the 70s version of Match Game on DVD. So you get to compare the formats, and I think pretty much everybody agrees the 70s version is better than the 60s version.
Yeah, it is, because I've watched a couple episodes of the 60s version. It's pretty interesting matching words, but there's not really much comedy to it. In fact, every time a correct answer is matched on the 60s Match Game, it makes the same sound effect as the lightning round getting an answer correct. So I'm just thinking about password when I'm hearing that. Of course, the 70s Match Game also used the Price is Right ding as well. So a friend of mine watching Match Game, it's like, hey, wait a minute, that's the sound effect on the Price is Right. He's like, well, a lot of Goodson Todman game shows use that sound effect, not just the Price is Right.
Yeah. And they recycled set pieces. They recycled some of the game elements, some of the sound effects and that sort of thing, which makes sense. Game shows were considered to have been cheaply produced, so they were able to, keep them on a low budget, which is one reason that the networks back in the day used to show as many game shows as popular, and that's one reason that Goodson Todman was so highly successful as television producers, because they had the best of the games.
They did. And it's interesting you mentioned recycling of set pieces. One thing I can think in particular was in 1970, I guess late 72, early 73, Gene Rayburn hosted a pilot called Celebrity Matchmates, which the next year got picked up as Tattletales. But looking at that one picture that they have, I'm sure there's some others somewhere, of the Celebrity Matchmates pilot, the set looks an awful lot, at least the floor plan looks an awful lot like the Match Game set.
Oh, that's interesting. They probably did use it. Because since it was a pilot, they probably, well, I don't know how set in stone they would have been. If they were just testing it out or just feeling out the format, they probably did use an already existing set rather than, and kind of get the game on its feet, see how it plays, and then develop the set from there, or, do some tinkering with what their original concept was before building a more permanent set.
Now, also, speaking of which, I remember after the Match Game Hollywood Squares Hour got canceled, I read somewhere that they actually taped a Match Game pilot hosted by Gene Rayburn. Does that pilot exist anywhere?
Was this the, let's see, would that have been 1988?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
89?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was 1984 or 1988 because they said 84, which doesn't sound believable just because the Match Game Hollywood Squares Hour had just been canceled, and I'm not sure Mark Goodson would right away do a pilot for a game that had just been canceled. It was maybe possibly for syndication, but it was just Match Game. It wasn't Hollywood Squares included.
Because I don't know if that would have been, I'm assuming it would have been the Ross Schaefer version, which I think was 88. I don't have it in front of me. I know that one of the things, and Peter Marshall told me this story, Gene was getting ready to, or was all set, or was looking forward to the idea of hosting a new revamped version of Match Game, and then Entertainment Tonight came out with, as they always did, happy birthday, Gene Rayburn, age 79, or whatever his actual age was in that particular year. And all of a sudden, that killed the deal and really made Gene not just angry, but also feeling quite bitter because, the general consensus is, we need a younger, more vibrant host, despite the fact that he was such a pro and still, adept at the game. I don't know. I know I have not seen it. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Whether it exists in the greater world, it may very well, because every now and then they come up with some undiscovered pilot or something that, had been kept in the back room of whether a storage closet at, the studio, or whether it somehow just got passed around in the production circles, and somebody kept it alive and then brought it out, and then somebody makes a deal and it airs as a special one-off episode of, Buzzer or the Game Show Network or something like that, or on a DVD. I would love to see it. I hope it exists. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of game shows, it's interesting because I interned with Oldies 93 KCBS FM about 32 years ago. It was at Columbia Square, where the Jack Benny program was made on the radio version, as well as Burns and Allen and a bunch of other great CBS classics on the West Coast. The Columbia Square building is still there, which is great because it was being threatened with demolition, but it's an historical landmark, been restored to its showroom shine. But I remember going into what was one of the auditoriums for the old radio shows, and inside that auditorium, in each of the levels of the risers or the seats, were all these boxes of tapes, probably videotapes, audio tapes. And I'm kind of curious what was in those boxes and who now has those boxes. I'm wondering, were there some old CBS shows that were saved there that people didn't know about? was obviously the original Match Game would not be in those boxes because that was on NBC. But it makes me wonder, was there anything kept at Rockefeller Center in a storage unit like that nobody knows about that might actually have all those episodes intact somehow? Kind of like with the original Hollywood Squares about 22 years ago, when in North Hollywood they were looking for episodes of Dark Shadows, and they turns out they found out about, I don't know, close to 3,000 episodes of the original Hollywood Squares.
Yeah, because Peter Marshall had it in his memoir that, many of the episodes had been lost, and then shortly after his book was published was when they discovered all these tapes, and it started rerunning on, I think, the Game Show Network at that point. I had, one always hopes that additional episodes of, the original Match Game or some other TV show that, we don't have copies of would come to light. I think it was Diane Janover who had worked as the celebrity coordinator on the 60s version of Match Game, and she was also associate producer at that point. Later on in the 70s, she worked as the contestant coordinator. But because she had worked in New York, I asked her if she thought there might, what the chances are of finding additional 60s version of Match Game tapes. And she said, well, you have to keep in mind, in New York, they have so little space. They don't have storage space there like we have out here in Los Angeles. So the likelihood of finding tapes is pretty unlikely. If they have not been found already, chances are they don't exist, simply because at that time, again, they just viewed game shows as disposable, and so they would just reuse the tapes. People would use the words recycling, and that suggests you would just chuck them in the bin to be melted down, and that wasn't quite it. They would use the tapes, and they would just simply retape over them. And so in that sense, they, it saved money because tapes, of course, cost a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
And unless there were a handful of episodes that they were keeping, just in case they had some last-minute rerun in order, had to have something to throw on the television because some other show didn't make the taping date or something like that. Most of the time, they just didn't keep those shows.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can always hope, I guess. Maybe somebody filmed their projector in front of the TV set and recorded it with the audio.
Well, and crazier things have been discovered to have happened, so you never know.
Oh, definitely. We're talking with A. Ashley Hoff. He's the author of Match Game 101, a backstage history of Match Game. And by the way, if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, please do. Tell your friends to do so as well. We have new interviews every couple of days, and we'd love to have you do that. Tell your friends as well. And if you have any suggestions for interviews, email me, joshdj57@gmail.com. That's joshdj57@gmail.com. Also, subscribe to us on Instagram, or follow us on Instagram, not subscribe. That's the follow button on Instagram. Subscribe here on YouTube. And next time, Ashley talks about his new book, With Love, Mommy Dearest, the making of an unintentional camp classic.